Well, thank you for joining us today. I think we're the only thing standing between you and alcohol outside. So we'll make this quick. But I wanted to welcome Jonathan, who's the co-founder and CEO of Turing, to really wrap up the panel for the day. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you, Ashu.
Maybe you can start a little bit by talking about your vision for Turing and the future of the talent cloud.
Yeah, thank you. And firstly, how's everybody doing?
Woo!
Great. And Ashu, you know the Turing story really well. My co-founder Vijay and I, we actually started the company at Foundation's offices.
Yes.
And the vision for Turing is super simple. Firstly, how many of you have found it really painful to hire engineers and build engineering teams? Show of hands. Okay, that's great. So we started Turing because traditional recruiting as we know it is over. Traditional recruiting was never designed for a software-first world. And if you look at traditional recruiting solutions, whether it's a recruiting firm, a staffing firm, a labor marketplace, or an IT services company, I hope I didn't offend a lot of companies. They have three fatal flaws. First, they're super slow, right? Mostly because they tap into a very limited talent pool. Second, not enough vetting. To find one engineer, you have to interview 20, 30 people, which is super time consuming. And third, not enough good controls for productivity, retention, et cetera, after you found your perfect team. So we asked ourselves at Turing, what if we could solve this with an AI-first talent cloud? What if you could push a button to spin up your engineering team as easily as you'd spin up servers in the cloud? What if you had AI-powered vetting and matching? And what if you had great controls for productivity, compliance, security after the match? This is why we built Turing. It's the world's best engineering team for your project vetted by AI. And it's been incredible over the last couple of years. We have more than 400 wonderful companies building on top of Turing's talent cloud. These include Disney, Johnson & Johnson, Rivian, Volvo, and many more.
So, post-COVID, this seems almost the way we all work. It's we all take remote first almost for granted in a sense. But pre-COVID, it was a new idea. And I'm sure you faced challenges, and many of your early customers had faced many challenges along the way. Can you talk a little bit about the journey and how things have changed?
Yeah. I mean, COVID was an incredible tailwind for Turing. And Ashu, you know this, Turing's revenues went from 1 to 100 million in about 3 years. In this remarkable last few years, Turing became a unicorn last year. And I think we are entering this golden era of remote work. And one of our panelists earlier today, Darren Moore from GitLab, said that 5 years from now, we won't call it remote work, we'll just call it work. Right? And just like we don't say telephone, we just say phone. And it's going to be an exciting time for all of us. And we're still in the early innings.
And if you look at some of your customers who've embraced this and who've really moved towards who started to think about talent in a global manner and who are truly thinking remote first, what are some of the lessons that everyone else could learn from them?
I think the first lesson is to really think about how you want to recruit, right? Like, do you want to look for, keep your recruiting radius to be people who live near the office, or do you want your recruiting radius to be people regardless of where they're based? And many of Turing's customers have adopted that latter approach. Now there are so many wonderful solutions to hire people from anywhere, like payroll is simplified, compliance is simplified, talent is simplified, evaluating people is simplified. So they've taken that leap. And it is a little bit of an adjusting period, particularly for vetting. So when you are recruiting from Silicon Valley, say, for hiring your engineering team, you can rely on credentials as a shorthand. Maybe you look at who went to Stanford, Berkeley, places that you know of, or who's worked at companies like Google, Apple, et cetera. But when you cast a planet-wide net, you can't rely on these credentials as shortcuts. You need to evaluate people based on their skills. And this is where Turing's AI-powered vetting has been helpful, where you can assess people based on skills and not credentials. we've had to build our vetting engine to evaluate developers for all sorts of roles, front-end, back-end, mobile, AI, data science, DevOps, et cetera, all types of tech stacks, all types of seniority levels. So you have to think of how you evaluate people differently. Like one of our star engineers, Jeremy from the Dominican Republic, if you look at his profile, he's one of the best Node developers you can find in the world.
Wow.
But on his LinkedIn profile, you can't tell.
It wouldn't be obvious at all.
You can't tell.
Yeah.
And at Turing, like, we are just proud that we are able to give these incredible developers an opportunity to let their code speak, for lack of a better word.
As you've made that transition, I'm sure there have been people who've had apprehensions. It makes, it empowers some people, but it makes others nervous. Can you talk a little bit about some of those apprehensions and how that has evolved over the last 3-4 years?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest apprehension used to come, like, for many of our customers, in the quality of the vetted talent. Like, Turing is a little bit like Moneyball for engineering talent,
Yep.
right? These underappreciated, undervalued talent in many, many cases. And in the early days of Turing, I mean, we have our CRO here who saw us from 0 to 100 million in revenues. In our early days, I remember we had to convince our customers to give these developers a chance. And the way we overcame that was we put our money where our mouth is. We told our customers, we have this machine learning model that's predicted that this developer would be a good match for this project. You can take this developer in a zero-risk 2-week trial. Free trial. And if it doesn't work out, you pay zero, we would still pay the developer. And our trials had a 90% success rate.
Wow.
And after the trial, we had almost a 97% retention rate. So that overcame some of the apprehension, even though this person didn't look good on paper, or there was no paper in many cases.
There was no evidence.
Yes.
In a traditional sense.
In a traditional sense. And some of the most wonderful engineers I know are also terrible at writing resumes, right? Like they write code, they don't write resumes. So it felt good to just put our sort of AI behind sort of giving these people the opportunity that their talent deserves.
It's been remarkable how well it's scaled over the last 4 years. How far do you think it can scale? Where do you see the future?
So if you look at the IT services industry, it's $1 trillion market growing by about 20% year over year. We see a future where by default, tech companies follow a boundaryless model for hiring and working with global talent. Not all companies can be boundaryless. Perhaps if you're building rockets or making cars, maybe you have to show up at the office or the factory. But for the rest of the world, what a wonderful time to be alive. Like if you're a software engineer in Brazil, for example, there was no better time to be alive. You're unencumbered by a visa, you're unencumbered by where you went to school, where you worked, who you know. Your LinkedIn mutual connections doesn't matter. All that matters is go to Turing.com, pass our vetting, and you could be working for Rivian or Coinbase or Disney.
Yeah. No, it truly is a remarkable change in mindset for every engineer on the planet. And you could be living, as you said, in Brazil or in India or hanging out on the beaches in Thailand and still have the same set of opportunities. How do you think this impacts the way entrepreneurs and CEOs think about building companies? For every Disney or Rivian or Coinbase that has embraced this approach, what do you think happens to those who are the laggards?
Yeah. So for CEOs who are starting companies today, for founders starting companies today, I would say it's good to have perhaps your early leadership team still based in a hub somewhere. Maybe it's Silicon Valley, maybe it's New York. But for the rest of your team, it's the best way to build your team is recruit from anywhere, recruit from any state in the US, recruit from any country in the world. Make sure you have systems built up. I think that's going to be the future. It used to be that to raise capital, you had to be near Menlo Park or near Palo Alto. But when I look at Turing, like out of the 140 million or so that we raised, like about 120 million of that was over Zoom, right? Like, I mean, technically we could have been anywhere.
You could have been anywhere, and
Yes.
even fundraising has moved to the cloud.
Yes.
And for Turing, and I see this in my portfolio too, that of all the companies that have started in the last 3 years, I would say 8 or 9 out of 10 have taken a remote-first approach. And as you said, they've in some cases had a core team in one location. In many cases, gone 100% remote first from day one. And given the economic environment we're going through, they are just competitively positioned in a very different way than folks who have built very high cost structures in one location, especially if that location is the Bay Area. What's interesting, though, is that this isn't necessarily limited to engineering roles alone. Where do you see this going? I mean, do you think this will be... Engineering is definitely going remote first, and boundaryless, what happens to other functions over time?
Yeah, and Ashu, you've joked with me about this over time, like about people coming to Foundation, talking about building a Turing for sales, or a Turing for China, or a Turing for data science. If you're building those companies, come join Turing. I'm kidding. You should start those companies. But jokes aside, when we were starting Turing, Ashu, it was not clear that a sales team could be distributed, for example. And conventional wisdom in Silicon Valley, even 5 years back, was, hey, sales teams should always be centralized, and Silicon Valley is too costly, maybe somewhere in Texas, right? And I remember speaking with our founding CRO, Prakash, and Prakash had the foresight at the time saying, hey, no, we're going to do this in a distributed fashion. And our CRO built our sales team in a fully distributed fashion, and to his credit, before COVID. And it just worked out wonderfully well for us. So clearly, sales can be done in a boundaryless fashion. Ashu, in your portfolio as well, you've backed some companies that are building tools that make sales teams also be more effective, collaborate better. Olive.ai was an interesting company that we used. And I think these tools are getting better. Functions that we thought couldn't be remote though we're seeing that they can be remote. In my mind, I just have two criteria for when I think something cannot be boundaryless. Number one, this may sound obvious, the job should be something you can do remotely, right? Again, some hardware companies, tough to do, but most software companies, you can do the job remotely. Second, the knowledge to do that job has to be something that's more widely distributed, right? I can imagine certain legal professions where maybe it's something specific to California law, maybe it'll be tough to find somebody in Mississippi. But for most other functions, I think we're going to go boundaryless, and I see this conference getting bigger and bigger as the decades roll on.
No, I think you're spot on. I mean, we've seen this with sales in Turing itself. I see this in a wide range of other companies where you're starting, because customers are becoming global as well. I mean, in one of my portfolio companies that I wouldn't name, the CEO jokes that he has all his salespeople in India and they don't need any accent training because half his customers are sitting in India too. And the other half that are in the US are also of Indian origin, but maybe that's too extreme. But I think we see that across functions in sales, in marketing, but obviously engineering has been leading the way. One of the things, as you rightly pointed out, is the ecosystem of tooling and technology does need to reinvent itself. Because most tools, even today, most people are using Slack and Zoom, and they're great. And they were the obvious tools to use when we all experienced COVID. But there's still very limited infrastructure in terms of toolings. Where do you see the opportunities for new technologies?
I think there's lots of opportunity for new technologies in this boundaryless future. Speaking of tooling, Ashu, like one other concept that's getting reinvented is the concept of an office, right? We heard from Liza, from Gable earlier today, and these flexible offices in the cloud, like that's a new thing. Because the biggest mistake people make is people think that in a remote-first company, you never meet, right? Nothing could be farther from the truth.
Absolutely.
At Turing, we believe in bringing teams and people together on a periodic basis. And companies like Gable, that are reinventing the concept of an office in a boundaryless future, I think are going to play a very important role.
In fact, what I've been seeing is that it's almost impossible to have a fixed office location today. Because when you want to rent a fixed office location, you have to make a 3-5 year view of actually where people will be based. And in a boundaryless world, any forecast that is more than 6-12 months out is outdated by definition.
Yeah.
Because the team locations organically evolve. And you will find that people live in different locations. You will have clusters in different geographies. As you said, you will bring, in some cases, the entire company together once in a while, although that will be rare as companies get larger. You will bring executive teams in some locations. But you also have to provide office space for folks to work day to day. Because many people do actually need to go out to an office space and can't necessarily work from home. So the balance, I think, is very interesting. What else? I mean, apart from tools, definitely tools to enable collaboration that are vertical specific. I think Volive is something that is uniquely enabling collaboration for salespeople and enabling sales managers to provide a level of oversight and supervision that is very hard to do without some technology. What are the other opportunities that you see beyond those kinds of tools?
Yeah, like I think of opportunities along what I think of as the 3 C's: collaboration, connection, and culture. In collaboration, I feel like we've scratched the surface. Slack, Zoom, G Suite are sort of the basic sort of bread and butter to get started. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of other tools that we could have. I think in connection, we still have a lot of room to get better. I don't think we've fully solved how to build meaningful relationships among people in a fully distributed team, and I think we are figuring that out. And culture, like how do you enforce the kind of norms that you would like in terms of a company's operations in this fully remote fashion? I think there's a lot more that we'll see. I feel like we've laid the foundation. If you look at how do you do payroll, how do you pay people in over 50 countries? I think we've solved that for the most part. How do you solve for compliance, HR? In this global context, I think we've kind of solved that. How do you talk to people, do meetings? We've kind of sort of solved that. But there's still so much more to come. Maybe it's a combination of getting telepresence right finally after many decades. We were joking about, Meta and Oculus. Maybe this is the metaverse. Maybe it is. Maybe there is an opportunity.
Maybe finally there is a use case for the metaverse.
Yeah. And I think I'm very excited about the future of remote work. I think there's lots and lots of opportunity. I think the way we evaluate people remotely is also going to change. You see a lot of interesting companies. Turing, of course, uses AI to evaluate software developers and match them based on their skills. But how do you evaluate a salesperson remotely? Can you evaluate a product manager remotely? How do you do video interviews more efficiently? There's, I think, lots of white space here.
Absolutely. And in fact, as you talked about culture and evaluation, it sort of brings me to sort of the, mentoring and training people is a very different challenge in a remote first world. And you've had to deal with it in Turing itself. Any lessons learned on how do you help, especially early career employees, grow and develop into managers in a remote first world?
I think it starts by first really understanding a person's career goals. For example, when a developer signs up on Turing, we ask them, where would you like to be 2 years from now? And people usually tell us they want to be in a certain industry, they want to be working on a certain tech stack, or they want to be working for a certain type of company. So I think the step one starts with understanding the career journey that an individual wants to take, and then giving them a clear path to get there over a period of time. Periodic performance reviews, check-ins help. We've also experimented with some third-party programs to help with L&D for some of our team members. We gave our developers a free subscription to Udacity, which was appreciated. Today we had a wonderful speaker from Data Protocol, which again was basically offering masterclass, but through a terminal, through the console, to have a developer sort of not switch away from the terminal to go to YouTube or somewhere else, which I thought was cool. And I think it's all about understanding where people want to go and making sure the company, maybe not as its primary goal, but at least as its secondary goal, giving people a chance to get there. The primary goal for a company should be make the company successful and build a valuable company. I think it's possible.
No, I totally agree. And I do think, though, it puts more onus on developing managerial skills. In a more traditional environment, management can almost happen by happenstance. And average managers can be successful. I think in a remote first world, the bar on excellence as a manager is much higher. As you said, managers have to be deliberate about and intentional about setting goals, intentional about identifying gaps between current skills and sort of aspirations, and intentional about providing interventions, whether it's training or projects or career opportunities that may be short term. And I think a lot of managers don't do that intentionally. And so as folks in the audience think about sort of building remote-first companies, I think that intentionality is very, very, very critical. And it has to be a part of the culture. If intentionality around management is not part of your culture, it's hard to integrate that over time. Like suddenly you find that, hey, we just don't put enough emphasis on that, and things start to break. What are some of the other experiences you've had as you've tried to take other functions beyond engineering remote first? What are some of the lessons learned in sales, for example?
So in sales, one of the lessons that we learned is how important it is to have good tools for data capture and learning so that we have good feedback loops. Again, there have been wonderful companies like Chorus, Gong, Olive, AI, and many others that have helped us kind of absorb the best practices of a top-performing salesperson and in a very systematic way ramp up the rest of the sales team very quickly, right? And this is, again, one of the interesting consequences of all meetings being Zoom meetings, right? Like, it's not something that we took for granted. When all meetings are Zoom meetings, you can record stuff, you can transcribe stuff, you can have it be searchable, you can do machine learning on what's working, what's not.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can see how your top-performing AEs are doing objection handling and use that to up-level others. And these are the fun externalities. Like, all meetings being Zoom meetings just totally opens up a kind of digital optimization you otherwise couldn't do.
Coming back to engineering and developers, in some ways there's been massive innovation in dev tools over the last 4 or 5 years. And on one hand, I think that innovation in dev tools will get carried over to other functions. I mean, we just talked about Olive and others in sales. I think that's just the start in other functions, whether it's sales or marketing, this notion of how do you learn from what has been successful for developers and implement that in other functions. But even for developers, I think we're barely scratching the surface. And there's such a massive opportunity to innovate on dev tools that are remote first and that are built for a boundaryless ecosystem. What are some of the things that you have seen that you feel like they may not be where you want to go, but are at least headed in that direction?
So there are 3 areas for developers that I see as potential white spaces. The first is onboarding. I think most companies suck at onboarding, like making a new hire productive, right? That's number 1. Number 2 is measuring productivity, right? Measuring developer productivity is such a tricky problem, right? So that's something that still hasn't been fully solved. And somewhat related to productivity would be performance management over time, like for that developer. And the third is security, right? I mean, today, Turing has Fortune 500 companies building on top of us. Their first question usually is security, right? How can I be confident that this with this group of developers building my product for me when I don't see them using their card to get into the building? They might be playing Tetris on their computers, but at least they're in front of me playing Tetris, not at home, right? So those three are issues. And productivity is so tricky, right? I mean, is an engineer who's productive, I mean, do you ask them to print out the code that they write? And how many lines of code did you write?
That's definitely back in vogue these days.
Yes. I mean, the minute you expose that, then it gets gamed, right?
Yes.
Like if there was an automatic way, if all you were evaluating was lines of code, that's for all of us in software engineering, it's just kind of silly.
Well, that's a good tool. That's a good use case for Copilot and AI.
Yes.